There's a moment that happens in every cold case investigation. It's the moment when a detective pulls up a file that's been gathering dust for 10, 20, sometimes 30 years. And somewhere in that file, buried in police evidence logs, stored in a freezer or sitting in a garage, is a hair, a blood sample, or a piece of DNA. Today, that biological evidence doesn't sit silently anymore. Today, it talks. And what it says has put 5 of America's most dangerous serial killers behind bars. Welcome back to The Verdict Room. I'm your host, and today we're examining the forensic breakthroughs that solved the unsolvable, cases that haunted families for decades and finally delivered the justice they deserved. Forensic science doesn't move at the speed of a criminal mind. Killers operate in the shadows, leaving victims scattered across states, sometimes decades apart. But forensic science, it's patient. It waits, and when technology catches up, when DNA analysis becomes cheaper, when genealogy databases become searchable, when ballistics matching becomes automated, justice, sometimes delayed, arrives with undeniable certainty. The difference between reasonable doubt and absolute guilt often comes down to a single strand of DNA, a fingerprint, a bullet casing, or a digital footprint. And over the past 20 years, we've watched forensic breakthroughs transform cold cases from unsolvable mysteries into courtroom convictions. Let's start with the most prolific serial killer confession in American history. In 2005, a man named Samuel Little was sitting in a federal prison in North Carolina, serving time for drug and weapons charges. He was 63 years old, with a weathered face and a criminal record stretching back to the 1970s. Over the course of several interrogations with law enforcement, Samuel Little made a confession that would shock the FBI. He claimed to have murdered over 100 women. 100. The sheer number made investigators skeptical. But as the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, or VICAP, began cross-referencing his confessions with unsolved homicides across the country, something extraordinary happened. They started matching, and matching, and matching. By the time the FBI released their official findings in 2019, they had confirmed 60 murders, making Samuel Little the most prolific serial killer in modern American history. But here's the legal problem that prosecutors faced. Samuel Little's confessions dated back decades. Some victims' remains had decomposed. Some crime scenes had been poorly documented. Some evidence was missing. The prosecution had to build cases on little more than Little's own admissions, photographs he drew from memory, and whatever forensic evidence could be recovered from decades-old cases. The challenge wasn't proving he killed them, he admitted it. The challenge was proving it in court in a way that satisfied the legal standard of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. What made these prosecutions possible wasn't a single forensic breakthrough. It was the cumulative power of cold case databases, DNA analysis of remains, and the willingness of law enforcement to revisit cases with fresh eyes and modern techniques. Little was convicted in multiple jurisdictions for multiple murders, serving consecutive life sentences. But those convictions didn't happen because of one moment of forensic revelation. They happened because forensic science, combined with investigative persistence, finally gave victims' families the answers they'd been waiting for. Now let's turn to a case that literally rewrote the playbook for how forensic science solves crime. On April 24, 2018, law enforcement arrested Joseph DeAngelo in Sacramento, California. DeAngelo was 72 years old, a former police officer, and the man behind a decades-long reign of terror that had haunted California since the 1970s. He was the Golden State Killer. The case is a perfect example of how one forensic breakthrough, DNA genealogy, changed everything about how we solve cold cases. Between 1974 and 1986, a man broke into homes across northern and central California, assaulting and murdering victims. The crimes were savage, calculated, and for decades completely unsolved. The killer left DNA evidence at multiple crime scenes, but in the 1980s and 1990s, that DNA sat in evidence lockers with no database match, no lead, nowhere to go. Then, in 2018, a genealogy database became the breakthrough. A forensic genealogist named Barbara Ray Venter was contacted by investigators. She took the Golden State Killer's DNA profile and uploaded it to a public genealogy website. What she found was shocking. distant relatives whose family trees she could map. Through careful genealogical detective work, she traced the DNA up the family tree, across branches and down again, until she landed on a name, Joseph DeAngelo. It was a masterstroke of modern forensic science, not traditional DNA matching, but DNA genealogy, using publicly available family tree information to connect an unknown suspect to their relatives. Law enforcement obtained a warrant, took a sample of DeAngelo's DNA, and confirmed the match. Within months, he was charged with 13 murders and over 50 sexual assaults. In 2018, Joseph DeAngelo pleaded guilty to his crimes, avoiding trial. He received 13 consecutive life sentences without parole. But the legal question that haunted this case was profound. Should DNA genealogy evidence be admissible in court? What privacy rights do people have when their genetic cousins upload family information to public databases? And when a confession follows a genealogical investigation, is that confession truly voluntary or the result of overwhelming forensic pressure? These questions are still being debated by courts across America in 2026. What's clear is that DNA genealogy solved a crime that traditional forensics couldn't crack for over 40 years. And that's just one example of how technology transforms justice. Let's move across the Atlantic for a moment to a case that shows how forensic breakthroughs can overcome the passage of time itself. In London, England in 1992, a woman named Rachel Nicholl was murdered in broad daylight on Wimbledon Common. The crime was shocking, the investigation was contentious, and for 35 years the case remained unsolved. Then, in 2008, a man named Robert Napper was serving a life sentence for an unrelated murder. When investigators tested his DNA against evidence from Rachel Nicholl's case, they got a match. A perfect match. Robert Napper had killed Rachel Nicholl in 1992, and forensic science had finally caught him. But only after 3 decades had passed. Napper was convicted of manslaughter in 2008 and remains imprisoned. The Nicholl family finally had an answer. Justice was served, but the delay was devastating. This case illustrates a crucial reality in forensic science. Evidence degrades, memories fade, witnesses disappear, and some killers evade justice for years. But modern DNA analysis can extract genetic material from samples that would have been useless 10, 20, or 30 years ago. The forensic technology changed. The evidence didn't. And that's the power of revisiting cold cases with fresh science. Now let's return to America for a case that shows how old-fashioned forensic technique, ballistics, solved a serial killer investigation that had stumped Los Angeles for years. In 2010, Los Angeles police announced the arrest of Lonnie Franklin Jr. in connection with a series of murders that had plagued South Los Angeles since 2002. Over the course of several years, at least 10 women had been murdered. The victims were vulnerable. Some were sex workers, some were homeless, some were living on the margins of society. For years, the case had stalled. Then, investigators used automated ballistics matching technology. Bullets recovered from different crime scenes were photographed and analyzed by computer. The software compared the ballistic signatures, the unique markings left by a gun's firing mechanism, across cases. And slowly, a pattern emerged. Multiple victims had been shot with the same gun. That gun, investigators determined, belonged to Lonnie Franklin Jr. In 2016, after a lengthy trial, Franklin was convicted of 10 murders and sentenced to death. He remains on California's death row. The ballistics evidence was critical. It connected crimes that otherwise seemed unrelated. It established a pattern. It proved a signature killing method. And it solved a series of murders that had devastated a community. Ballistics matching, once a manual process requiring expert comparison of shell casings under a microscope, had been revolutionized by digital analysis. The science got faster, the convictions got stronger. Now let's talk about a case that shook the foundation of how we understand serial killing and evidence recovery. In 2009, Cleveland police made a discovery that horrified the nation. Officers forced their way into a home on Seymour Avenue after a woman escaped and gave them the address. What they found was a house of horrors. Inside were 11 bodies, the remains of women who had been murdered and hidden by Anthony Sowell over the course of 16 years. Soul was a convicted sex offender who had been living openly in the community, and neighbors had no idea of the carnage occurring behind closed doors. The forensic challenge was monumental. Bodies were in various stages of decomposition, stacked in different rooms and crawl spaces. Identifying each victim required dental records, DNA analysis, and careful forensic pathology. Anthony Sowell was arrested, tried, and in 2011 convicted of 11 murders. He received 11 consecutive life sentences. The case became a stark example of how forensic science, DNA identification, dental record matching, autopsy procedures, can establish identity and cause of death even in the most degraded remains. It was also a case that highlighted a troubling reality. Serial killers often prey on vulnerable women, and their murders go undetected for shockingly long periods because law enforcement resources are stretched thin and because society pays less attention to missing women from marginalized communities. The forensic science finally gave those 11 women their names back. It gave their families answers. But the delay in catching Sowell represented a systemic failure in how law enforcement prioritizes missing persons cases. Now that we've examined 5 cases where forensic science finally delivered justice, let's talk about how the legal system actually handles this evidence in court. When a case is cold, when it's been sitting for decades, prosecutors face unique challenges. First, they must establish a proper chain of custody. This is a legal concept that means every person who has handled evidence must be documented and accounted for. If evidence has been lost, mishandled, or its chain of custody is broken, defense attorneys can argue that the evidence is unreliable. This is why cold case investigators are meticulous about documenting everything. Second, forensic evidence must meet the Daubert standard, a legal test that determines whether expert testimony about forensic science is admissible in court. The Daubert standard, established by the Supreme Court in 1993, requires that forensic techniques be reliable, that they've been tested, that they have a known error rate, and that they are accepted within the scientific community. This standard has become increasingly important in 2026 as courts grapple with newer forensic techniques like genealogy-based DNA matching and AI-enhanced forensic analysis. Defense attorneys are challenging the admissibility of these techniques, arguing that they haven't been sufficiently tested or peer-reviewed. Prosecutors, meanwhile, are arguing that the results are undeniably accurate. These are live debates happening in courtrooms right now. Third, when eyewitness testimony is involved, courts must be aware of the fallibility of memory. If a witness hasn't seen a suspect in 30 years and is now being asked to identify them in court, that identification may be unreliable. Modern forensic science doesn't have that problem. DNA doesn't lie. Ballistics don't misremember. That's why forensic evidence has become the gold standard in proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. But there's an important caveat. Forensic science can exclude suspects or prove guilt, but it can also be misused. In 2026, we're seeing a growing movement to reform how forensic evidence is presented in court. The Innocence Project has documented cases where forensic science was misinterpreted, where experts gave testimony beyond their expertise, or where the science itself was flawed. This means that while forensic breakthroughs solve cold cases, defense attorneys and judges must scrutinize how that evidence is presented, questioned, and proven. The admissibility of forensic evidence has become one of the most hotly debated topics in criminal law, and rightfully so. The stakes are as high as they get: liberty and life itself. Looking forward to 2026 and beyond, forensic science continues to evolve. DNA genealogy will likely face more legal challenges and regulatory refinement. AI-generated forensic analysis, where artificial intelligence enhances crime scene photographs, reconstructs fingerprints, or identifies patterns in ballistic evidence, is beginning to appear in cases. Courts are wrestling with questions about whether AI evidence should be treated differently than traditional forensics. Should juries see the AI's reasoning process? What's the error rate? Who's responsible if the AI misidentifies a suspect? These are the frontiers of forensic law in 2026. We've also seen DNA technology advance to the point where genealogy databases are being used proactively, not just reactively. Investigators can now upload DNA profiles to genealogy sites, before a crime is solved, casting a wide net. Some privacy advocates argue this violates people's rights to genetic privacy. Others argue that if you've uploaded your DNA to a public genealogy site, you've waived that privacy. These debates will shape how forensic science works for the next decade. What strikes me most powerfully about these 5 cases, Samuel Little, Joseph DeAngelo, Robert Napper, Lonnie Franklin Jr., and Anthony Sowell, is that they all share a common thread. They represent justice delayed, but justice finally delivered. These killers terrorized communities for years, sometimes decades, and then, through a combination of investigative persistence, technological innovation, and forensic science, they were caught and convicted. The families of their victims finally had answers. Closure is a word we use carefully in criminal justice because losing a loved one to murder never truly closes. But these cases gave families something precious. They gave them the truth. They gave them the name of the person responsible, and they removed that person from society permanently. The broader implication is this: in 2026, no cold case is truly cold anymore. Technology is advancing. Databases are growing, and forensic science is becoming more precise, more reliable, and more accessible. This is extraordinarily good news for families waiting for answers. It's also a cautionary tale for anyone who thinks they can commit murder and escape justice. Time may have once been a killer's best ally, but in the modern era of forensic science, time is the investigator's greatest weapon. But here's what I want you to think about as you leave this video. With all this forensic power, with all this ability to solve crimes, we're still grappling with a fundamental question. If forensic science can finally deliver justice for decades-old cases, why are we not allocating more resources to cold case investigations? Why do some cases get solved while thousands of others sit in evidence lockers gathering dust? Why do we see a pattern where the victims, often poor, often women of color, often vulnerable, are overlooked? The science of justice has advanced. The will to pursue it must advance as well. If you found this deep dive into forensic breakthroughs and criminal convictions compelling, I want to hear your verdict. Drop a comment below. Which of these cases shocked you most? What do you think about DNA genealogy? Brilliant investigative tool or privacy violation? And do you think we're doing enough to pursue cold cases in your community? Subscribe to The Verdict Room for more in-depth analysis of real cases, landmark court decisions, and the forensic science that changes everything. Because at The Verdict Room, we believe every case deserves a verdict, and every family deserves the truth. Thanks for watching.